What if I told you there's a secret to easily making R's and L's in English? What if I told you that your native language is what makes these sounds difficult? They're mostly difficult because you are fighting your native language's mouth posture, trying to fit a circle into a square. If this is your first time hearing about mouth posture, you can continue with this lesson, but I strongly recommend that you learn about the basic posture settings first. This is because the R and L in American English slightly modify our basic mouth posture settings and take over the center of gravity. So it's almost impossible to make a good quality, clear R or L without having these settings. I have a new special 3-step process that is helping most of my students to find a near perfect R pretty easily. We're going to start in our basic posture, that's step 0. So if you can do a nice, good, clear center of gravity sound, you're in a good place. So the first step is you're going to actually add a little bit of tension to the middle sides, which remember, normally we don't want that. We want as little tension as possible. We're going to go and tense those sides a little bit, not on the front, not on the back, just through the middle. And you're going to push into those inside corners of the teeth. You'll feel it on the 4th tooth, you'll feel it on the 5th tooth, you'll feel it on the 6th tooth, all those teeth in there. And when you do this, you have to actually add tension through the middle body as well. If you just push with the sides and tense the sides, you won't get the right result. So the middle body is actually going to come up just a little bit as it gets tense, but it's not going all the way to a fully formed yet. So if you just do that, we go from to You try. So we can already tell we're starting to get a little bit of that sound. Now, if you don't sound exactly like that, try to make sure that when you make that change, you're not breaking the other posture settings, especially in the top of the throat or the back of the tongue, because your language might want to start modifying things as soon as you tighten up. Step 2, you're going to focus on the front half of the middle. And what you're going to do is you're going to try to tighten that and pull it into the middle a little bit. Okay, so it'll be sort of tightening like it's like this, and it's going to sort of tighten like this a little bit. Again, just that front part of the middle. You try. Before we move to the 3rd step, what about the front of the tongue? It does not matter. The front of the tongue does not affect the in a significant way, and you can use either the retroflex or the bunched. But if you were told that you have to use the retroflex R, that teacher was wrong. I'm sorry to say. You will get some extra tension through the front when you do that 2nd step. Now the 3rd step. So this is really where the starts to take over the center of gravity and where we start modifying the posture a little bit. Now the back middle, that's where our is. So we're already pulled in the front middle. Now the back middle is also going to start bunching up and tightening up more. So you're going to get tension through the whole middle part, but this can cause some problems, which we're going to see in a minute. First, let's try this. So we start in 0. Go ahead and try that. There are a couple new posture details that we need to cover and some common mistakes that happen, usually because of that posture. Let's compare the basic map to the map step by step. So as we saw with the front of the tongue, you can be retroflex, you can be bunched. We don't really care what the front of the tongue is doing. Now the middle of the tongue, of course, as we saw, the is sort of this way, roughly speaking, and the is sort of this way in the middle. This is a big part of why it actually takes over that center of gravity, because we can't really hold that shape anymore. Now, what about the relationship between the sides of the middle and the body of the middle? We saw that in the basic posture, The middle body is generally lower than those sides. And we saw in a previous lesson how some sounds, at least in certain variations, can kind of break that, even though we do keep the space back here, we keep our hinge and all that other stuff. So with the obviously the middle body is coming up and it's going past where the sides are touching the teeth. So this would be a case where we can sort of get up into that space and break that. Now we saw that there's more tension in the tongue through the middle, there's more tension on the sides, we're sort of bracing the teeth, so that's a difference. The fourth tooth contact of the hinge. Some of you might have noticed that when you tried to pull that middle in and tense it up a bit, maybe you felt like you were sliding onto the fifth tooth, and that is 100% fine. This is the only sound that can really do this, and it's because of how it's affecting the middle and pulling things in. You can still be anchored on the fourth tooth, maybe feel it come back a little bit. That also works, but if you slide mostly off of the fourth tooth and you're more anchored on the fifth tooth now, no problem for the R. Just make sure that when you release that R, that you get back onto that fourth tooth in our normal posture settings. Now if we go to the back of the tongue and the top of the throat, especially the back of the tongue, will have a pretty significant change or detail here that you absolutely have to have. And there's probably a bit of a range here. So one teacher or native speaker might explain it one way compared to how I'm going to explain it. This is again based on how it feels in my mouth, but the way that I'm going to tell you helps you keep the space. We saw that when the front middle sort of pulls in and tightens, that'll sort of bring the front of the tongue with it a little bit, and that's okay. When the back middle pulls in and tightens, front of the tongue can get pulled with that. But what it's also going to do, because now it's kind of taking up too much space here. So how it feels in my mouth is that when the middle tightens up and pulls in here, the back will actually sort of put, instead of being like say right here, it'll sort of push forward into the middle of the tongue so that it's not just being pulled up and blocking the way. So it helps keep that space and supports the middle of the tongue to produce the Then the top of the throat, you've got to make sure that you don't tighten up here. You might actually need to add a little bit of extra, maybe outward push here to hold this open so it doesn't collapse as the back of the tongue comes forward. And it's kind of one unit. The back of the tongue, the top of the throat, they'll kind of help hold open this space. Now the soft palate can maybe sort of get out of the way a little bit more to help keep that space. Not as important. If you have a more nasally sounding language like Thai, then you just got to make sure that you don't sound nasally when you're doing your R, not like okay, gotta get that nose more closed. But as long as you feel like you have enough space and it sounds good and clear, then you don't have to worry too much about the soft palate. Now for the lips, we saw with like and sh, and some of these other sounds that we have this basic front biased movement where we might sort of push forward in the corners a bit, lift this up, push this down as it comes up and out a little. Okay, we saw that movement in several sounds. The uses that exact same movement. There's no change, there's no difference. We don't want tension in the sides or anything like that. It's not required to make the sound, but I have noticed that at least half of the students that I've worked on with the R, even if in here is good, if they don't use the lips, they might sound a little off or a little too closed, and when they add the lips, they sound a lot clearer. That's really the purpose of getting those lips open. So I do recommend, for the R at least, that you do try to get that basic motion, say it nice and clear, but it's not 100% required to form the sound. Of course, we can't forget about the jaw. Now, when we do the jaw can maybe close up a little bit. I would really just try to keep the jaw where it is, because a common mistake that people make is instead of using that tongue muscle, because maybe they don't have enough of that strength in the middle yet, they'll actually try to get that middle up by closing the jaw more, and then you have even less space, right? That's not how you do it. You got to actually engage that middle body to get higher, and the jaw should stay more or less where it is. Now, a couple mistakes and things to be aware of here. We are not breaking the basic tongue height setting. Just like when we do k or u or whatever, we bring the back of the tongue up. We're not bringing the whole tongue up, we're just using that back of tongue muscle to lift up, but the setting stays low, and when you're done with those sounds, that part of the tongue goes right back to its low, full setting. So it comes from that low setting, and everything else stays low. When you're doing like the E or the T or the S, we're more on the front part of the tongue, back stays low, okay? This comes up, we don't bring the whole tongue up, and then when we're done with that sound, it goes back to where it was. It's the same thing with the R, okay? The R comes up from that low setting, but the back of the tongue stays low, the front of the tongue stays low, relatively speaking, right? We saw that the middle sort of pulls them in a bit, but we're not trying to bring the whole tongue up with the middle, okay? That's why we get this sort of shape like this. We're not bringing everything up like this. The tongue back in a setting also does not change. Even though that back of the tongue can sort of push into the middle to help support it and keep a little more space there, we're not pushing the whole tongue forward when we do that. That would be a big mistake. The voice placement setting and the top of the throat setting, again, we can maybe hold it a little more open, but my voice is still coming from down here at the bottom of my throat. And the last common mistake here that we're going to mention is when you try to do that R and you're trying to get it nice and tight and rounded and sort of filling up that space, you might go a little too high in the middle, okay? Especially if your overall tongue setting isn't low enough and you don't have the space here because you're still tight in the throat, everything is too high. Let's say all that's in place and then you just do too much in the middle. There's this part of my mouth that goes up here in the middle section, and I'm sort of filling some of that space, but you can't fill all of that space. Okay, so if you feel there's like the top of your mouth doing this and then your tongue is like right there underneath it, almost touching, you're too high. Okay, you got to give a little bit of space in there so that everything can come through nice and clearly. One common mistake that a lot of students make and that they have to figure out how to do is using the least amount of tension possible to clearly articulate the sound. So part of that is removing the tension that you hold in your native posture through your tongue or through your lips or whatever, especially for sounds that are shared, like many languages have the E, but your E probably has a lot more tension through your tongue. So this is equally true with the You don't want to over-tense the inside the mouth. Before we look at the R-colored vowels, let's first do some basic exercises with the regular sound. As I talked about in the main lesson for the R sound, the practical real-life reality is that you can use as both a consonant and a vowel. And don't worry about all those crazy IPA symbols. In American English, the only real difference between the consonant and the vowel is that the consonant is relatively a little shorter in comparison to the vowel. So for example, we say run, we don't say run. We say earth, we don't say earth. Just know that as we go through these exercises, it doesn't matter if you see a consonant or a vowel. Is Note that as I transitioned in and out of that R, I made sure that I got back on that fourth tooth in all my posture settings when going into and I made sure that I kept enough space here when transitioning into so it all sounded nice and clear. There's one more detail that I haven't mentioned in other videos. This is with the WR spelling pattern. I might have talked about this in other places a little bit, and if I did, what I told you was that there's no W. And that's technically true. You don't have to use the lips, you don't have to try to put a W before it. It's not wrong or something like that. That would be completely wrong. However, the new detail is that when you have the W and then the R consonant, so like wrong, or even if you just have an R consonant like right, run, etc. at the start of a word, then what you can actually do is you can use the lips like the W. So instead of doing it like this, you can actually be fully in that W position, but inside, instead of doing a W, you're doing an R. Run, right, wrong. Or you can be in this raised lip position like we've talked about before. Run, right, wrong. And then of course, as we said before, you don't actually have to use the lips at all. Now there's a reason why this connection exists, and it has to do with the fact that native English speaking children, when they are learning how to speak the language, the first sound that develops between W and R is W. R is one of the last sounds that native speaking children master, and so they tend to replace the R consonant with a W sound, and then they replace the R vowel with a schwa sound. So in the word brother, they'll say bwa the. And for a very small number of people, this actually never goes away and they never develop the R sound. The first thing I want to mention here is the importance of the center of gravity. As we saw, the mostly takes over the center of gravity and affects the posture, and this is actually what changes the quality of the vowel that it is coloring or controlling. That's why these are called R-colored or R-controlled vowels. And I think that's a useful, important term. R-controlled. So instead of being controlled by our normal posture, normal center of gravity, they're being now controlled by the instead. In American English, all sounds except for the and the dark L, are schwa colored or schwa controlled, which is what helps give them their American quality. This is one big reason why the a in British English or the e in Indian English, for example, sound like they have a little bit of a different quality, even though they are technically the same sound. We're going to see this with ah and r, for example, where the ah is the same sound, but it's being slightly modified and controlled or colored by that r center of gravity and posture instead of the. So it seems different, but it's the same sound. This can also have an effect on some consonant sounds, but we're going to come back to that later. Now this brings us to a very, very, very important concept called preloading, and we need to understand this if we're going to understand how to properly control or color those vowels in a different way. There are many ways that we can preload the next sound, but a very common and easy example is when one sound is using the lips and the other sound is using the tongue. So we know the f, v, and the p, b, are just using the lips. We don't really have the tongue involved at all. It just stays in its basic position. If I do, for example, the word few, so we have the F sound on the lips, and then we have that Y sound going into an oo, f, y, oo, few. Now, you can sort of do those in order, few. So I have that that regular relaxed tongue under my F, few, few. And I might start moving into that Y so that we can sort of, we don't want to hear you, right? There shouldn't be an there. So I'll probably start moving into the Y, but I'm not actually in the Y. That's not preloading. What preloading would be is as I'm doing the F, inside my mouth, my tongue is already doing the Y sound. So instead of y, it's going to be, and we can already tell that this is slightly changing how the air is coming out, because inside of my mouth, instead of my tongue being low, relaxed, just sort of sitting in I'm now up in that Y sound, and it's changing the space in the mouth. It's changing how the air is flowing through. It's also even maybe getting a little bit of tension on the lips, but very, very little. I'm also, because I know that oo is after, I'm actually getting just a tiny bit of preparation here to start moving through that oo as well, all the way in the F. So instead of just it's like I can get the tension here because I'm gonna ooh, right? Ooh, See, while I'm doing that Y, my lips are actually already starting to go through that ooh position a little bit. Feel. And as I release that Y, then the lips continue and we start hearing that ooh come through. So I preloaded the Y under the F, because the F is just lips, and then I also started preloading the lip motion of the ooh all the way in the F, but especially through the Y. Normally you don't have to worry about preloading through three sounds. That's sort of a special thing, but it's pretty common to do that with 2 sounds. So hopefully that gives you a basic idea of what preloading means, right? The pre is because we're loading the next sound before finishing the first sound, okay? Instead of doing one sound, one sound, one sound, because we don't speak that way. So with that in mind, let's look at R, because R is the easiest R-colored or R-controlled vowel to explain this with. It's going to be nice and clear with that ah sound. First, like the diphthongs, a, I, ow, and oi, we have a different start point and a different end point. And we have to blend them, not have them be 2 completely separate sounds like ah, But the basic way to do an R-colored or R-controlled R sound, so we need to take the regular ah, so you have to be able to do that, right? We start in our center of gravity, our posture. We place that ah on the back of the tongue. Again, we're using the caught merger. If you want to use the unmerged sounds, you can learn about those somewhere else. I don't teach those. You'll still sound great. You'll still sound neutral. But we can't just be making the already. And that would make sense because when we're doing ah, we're not doing It's the center of gravity and that sort of shape and tension and basic posture is under it, but we're not fully doing as we're doing ah, right? Ah is a separate sound, so we need to do that sound on the back of the tongue. So it's the same with We're not trying to do and ah at the exact same time. What we need to do is start modifying that posture a little bit to match what the does for the posture. So we're not going to worry about the front of the tongue or the hinge or anything like that so much because we're in ah, we're open. And what we're going to do is when we do that ah, we're going to use that little bit of tension back here that we would have in the maybe pushing a little forward with the back in order to start making that ah sound like there's an underneath it. So that would sound something like this. Ah, ah, instead of ah. Now they sound quite similar, but there's a little bit of extra tension or restriction in the second one. So if we start in that ah, and then we start moving straight up into the we're not even going to pass through the schwa like we normally would when we release the ah into another sound. We're going to go straight up and start forming that meaning that the tongue is going to start getting that shape that we talked about, whether bunch or retroflex, it doesn't matter. And again, you can be on the 4th tooth hinge when you close, or you can even be on the 5th tooth hinge. Just make sure you keep enough space and you get into that R properly. So we can see this is a lot more advanced than just doing an R sound, right? But if we do ah, So all of that is exactly the same as if I were to do ah into except, obviously we're doing the and then the lips get involved for the which again is optional, but we're probably going to use them at least a little bit. R. We speed that up. R. The only slight change in the ah, remember we don't round the lips for the merged ah. There's no tension or anything. But because we are preparing to go into that and technically we have that preloaded tension of the in the ah, that's coloring it. So I can feel, especially when I go a little faster, I can feel as I start closing that my tongue is already kind of starting to shape like this a bit. And as it gets up onto the teeth, instead of it feeling sort of like this, like it's just coming up like this onto the teeth, again, there is that difference between the body and the sides a bit, but it almost feels sort of like it's coming up like this onto the teeth instead of like this onto the teeth. So there's going to be a different feeling in the mouth as you go from the ah into the Of course, the biggest mistake to avoid here with the ah, whether it's R-colored or not, don't go into the throat, don't have your throat be tight. Ah, ah, we don't want it to be back here, we want it to be up here. There's an alternative to doing these colored vowels. And what that is to actually not color them. Now this can be a little tricky because we're still technically supposed to blend between the two sounds, but let's see how this works. So if I do a regular ah, and then I try to go up into an but I'm doing a regular ah, so I don't want them to sound completely separate. It's not ah-er or ah-er. We still have to sort of blend them into one syllable, into one space, one sound, but you don't have to preload that R tension or whatever to get that R controlled quality. You do a regular ah. You'll actually go a little bit through the If you go slow, you'll hear it. If you're speaking normal speed, you don't want to hear it. We're not saying as 3 sounds, no. We have that center of gravity. So we're going to slowly get just a little bit of that and then start forming the So there, when I start going through that little I'm releasing the I'm bringing my tongue back up into its regular hinge, regular posture settings with but then as soon as it starts getting into place, it immediately continues into the R. Just like if I were to go from into t, like thought, I can go from the I close up onto the hinge, and then the front of the tongue just keeps going up into the T, right, while this all stays in its normal place. So if I speed that up, R. Now we don't really hear that in between anymore because it's so small and it's just the glue, right? Just like we don't really hear it between and t unless we go really slow. That's good, that's what we want. Now, if it is easier for you to do this non-colored R version, then you can do that, but you have to make sure you do it properly. So this gives you some wiggle room and some choices, but in reality, the way that natives speak, any given time we say R, right? Say we say it 10 times, it could be 3 or 4 of those times we don't actually color it, and the rest of the time we do, or whatever. It doesn't really matter. Whichever one comes out is fine. As long as it's done properly, it sounds nice and clear. Now these next ones aren't going to take us as long to talk about because we got a lot of the basic concepts out of the way with R. But notice that I mentioned that there are only really 4 R-colored vowels you need to do. I've talked about this in the main lessons before, but they are R, ear or air. It doesn't matter which one you start with, as long as you're somewhere in there, it will be fine. Air, using the e as in bed, or using the O sound. We're going to talk about some of those details when we get there about what's a little different in how I teach this. So just hold that thought for a moment. Now there are some other possible R-colored vowels, particularly the R-colored A as in cat. This one is not at all required. You'll still sound perfectly natural and neutral. It basically became e, so anything that would use ar is now air. And anything that did use air is still air. This is called the Mary-Mary merger, and most Americans have this at this point. There are some speakers who don't, but it doesn't matter. So if you want to do the R-colored A, you'll have to figure that out on your own. Let's talk about the R-colored E or I. Again, you can start up in the E, you can start up in the I, you can be anywhere in between. It does not matter as long as you're not doing as long as you're not doing like a Y, right? You got to be within the range of those 2 sounds, but that's the good news, is you have a lot of wiggle room there. Now, if we do the non-colored version of this, when you start in that E or that I, you're not going to have the tension of the you're not going to have that slight posture modification of the We're going to be in our normal center of gravity. So we're going to say like E or I. And then you're going to, as soon as you start leaving, remember, we're not doing 2 separate sounds. We're not doing or E-er, something like that. We still have to blend them and pull them into one space, one vowel sound. So as soon as you start leaving that E, remember, when we go from E to any other vowel, this is one reason why I consider the R also to be a vowel sound. When we go from E to any other vowel, or I to any other vowel, there's going to be a small Y between. If we do this slowly, just like when we did up into not colored, slowly we heard that little bit of an because we released it and then got up into the Here, as we start releasing this E, we're going to hear a little bit of that Y sound linking, but mostly only at slow speed. So if we do ear, now the Y was actually towards the end of that Y, it started to get a little colored because we started to form that in order to blend them. ear. So you're kind of doing like, as you move from the E or the I, you sort of start in like a normal small Y with a normal center of gravity, normal posture, openness, all that stuff. But as you get through that Y, that's where the R starts to form and take over. So it's like half of a regular small y and then half of an R-colored small y. And that's how we're going to sort of blend them, even though we're not R-coloring the E or the I in this version. Now, how do we do the actual R-colored version? Well, again, we're going to start in E or I or anywhere in between. And while you are doing that E, I, or between, you're already going to have that little bit of tension for the You're going to have the slightly modified posture for the So the E, if we R-color that and just do an E itself, instead of E, that's colored, schwa colored, we're going to do E, 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 E. So we can already hear some restriction back here, and it doesn't necessarily have to be exactly like that. I'm just trying to give you an example here. Other people might do it slightly differently. The way I do it, it might come out a little bit differently as well. The point is just that while I'm doing that E, I'm already getting a little tension here. I'm starting to fill up a little bit of that space. I'm modifying my posture back here just a little bit, and we're hearing that R start to come through and color that E. E, E. If I do an I, regular, R-colored, So it's just this little change back here, a little bit in the middle, a little bit in the back, as we're preparing to do the R, but we're not actually doing the full R yet. Then as we leave that E or I or somewhere in between, we immediately start forming the R as we go through. Now here you will not hear a small Y because the R just sort of takes over. Ear, ear. Technically, you can maybe hear like an R-colored small Y in there if you listen really close, but it's definitely not a regular Y. So we're just R tension all the way through and then more R, more R, more R, more R until we're fully in that R end position. Now what this also means is on the hinge, right, we saw that E can potentially stretch forward a bit. It doesn't necessarily have to, but it can. I can also maybe stretch forward a little bit. And so we're on the fourth tooth normally for E and I, and that's where we're going to start even in the R-colored version. The only difference between the E and the I or most other sounds is we might have that little pull, but we're still on the fourth tooth. The difference in the R-colored version is that it doesn't really matter if there's a little pull forward here or not. We are going to start to pull back a little from the start before we even form the sound. It's going to have a slightly different starting hinge position, still on the fourth tooth, but maybe just a little farther back. As we go through that E or I, and then we start forming more and more into the that's when you can start pulling from the fourth tooth onto the fifth tooth. Again, for the you don't have to do the fifth tooth, it can still be the fourth tooth. But if you're going to shift onto the fifth tooth, you have to do it as you pull into the not start on the fifth tooth. Now for the lips, they're going to work the same as the E or the I normally, where we can get that little pull when we start. And then of course we can transition into the lips, which neither of these for the E, the I, or the are required, but we do tend to use them to some degree. Ear, ear. So in addition to pulling here, and if I do like E, I can actually, again, I'm not tight and clamping down like this, but I can, in addition, while pulling this way, get a little bit of tension in the corners, like I'm gonna start pushing them forward straight from the beginning. E, and then as I come forward, instead of releasing E, E, or E, E, right, we just go back to neutral lips. Instead of that, as we release the pull here for the E or the I, we're actually going to start doing that pushing all the way through. Ear, or if I use no lips at all, ear. You can also see that maybe my jaw wants to kind of close up a little bit. Again, we saw we can do that going into the but don't rely on that. Make sure that you're shifting properly and you're keeping the space. The next R-colored vowel is air. Now, if we do the non-R-colored version, you're going to hear that there's a tiny little bit of that schwa between, but we're not going to go all the way into that and then up into because then we're putting an extra sound between. Remember, it's just the center of gravity that's there because we're not coloring the eh. So you're gonna follow a path instead of like er. You're gonna have to start moving as you're releasing the eh. If you're going slow, not if you're going normal speed, if you're going slow, once you start releasing that eh and you hear that little tiny bit of an start to form, then you need to redirect to the But notice that the eh itself sounds very normal. Now if we do an R colored eh, the quality of that eh is going to change a little bit because we're going to have that sort of, again, not a full R, but the tension of starting to form that R is going to be underneath. We're going to have a little bit more tension back here, soft palate, all the things that are in the R. So instead of eh, it's going to be more like air, eh, 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 eh. The tongue itself is also just a little bit more tense, especially along the sides again, because we're starting to preload that Like we saw for the E and the I, how because that preloading of the can sort of move the E or the I back a little bit, it's the same with the eh. It doesn't necessarily have to, but it can. So if your eh is usually, say, maybe around here, and then now you feel like it's kind of back here a little bit, as long as you're still forming the sound properly, remember the sound is more here, not up here, and you're preloading everything right and it sounds nice and good, then that's fine. There's a little bit of wiggle room there in the exact forwardness of the sound. Not the whole tongue posture, just the forwardness of the sound. Lastly, with the lips, of course, it's the same thing. We know that eh can slightly pull the lips out, and that's fine. You don't have to. When you're doing the again, they're not required, but we're going to get some tension here, push them up and out, So when you're combining these two, just like we saw with E and I, you can preload a little bit of tension in the corners. You can pull the lips to the side for eh. I'm still not tight and holding them like this. There's just a little tension there. As I start that transition, before I even really start forming the fully, I'm already starting to engage the lips to start forming the there. I'm like halfway between the eh and the and my lips are already kind of right here. This overlapping motion between the lips and what's going on in the mouth is actually part of what can help us blend the sounds together better. Let's move on to or. So the first big important detail that we have to talk about is what are we starting from? Because the traditional, normal, standard way that this is taught is you start from the and then you move into the or however that works. But of course I have the Cot-Caught merger. I teach with the Cot-Caught merger, so technically I don't have and I just have on the back. If you want to use the unmerged in your or, then you're going to have to figure out how to do that because I'm not teaching that. But again, you will sound perfectly natural. You will sound very neutral. It doesn't matter if you do it the way that I do it. It makes it easier for you. So instead of trying to do like or something like that, we're going to start in the O. Again, remember the regular O, we tend to start a little bit more towards the and we'll move up into it. But instead of that, when we do the oi, we're already in that O position. The lips are already engaged. And then we move into the I, or around there, right? Oi. Sounds kind of like an E, but it's not. With the or, we're going to do exactly the same thing. So you're going to start in that O. Okay, and again, there's the colored version and the non-colored version. So you're going to start in the O. If you do the non-colored version, you're going to start like you would for oi. So oi uses just the center of gravity, so it's going to be exactly the same. O, okay. Then, as you start moving towards that you're going to sort of go a little bit into the like you're just releasing that O, like you would for oi. But instead of going all the way up into oi, you're going to redirect into the So, or. So it's just a different endpoint. Instead of trying to get all the way up here to that sort of type sound, we're just going this way and then shifting to the middle for that What if we do an actual R colored or R controlled or? So now the O itself, straight from the beginning, again, we're going to maybe get a little tension in the throat, a little tension in the soft palate. The is going to be a little preloaded. It's going to become more or less that center of gravity. So the O is going to sound a little more tense. So instead of O, it's going to be more like O, 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 O. They sound very similar, right? But when I do the regular one, I can feel that the middle of my tongue sort of feels like it wants to do this, because that's the center of gravity. It's not necessarily shaped like that, but it feels like that. And then when I try to do the I can feel that that sort of flattens out and raises up a little bit, and that helps change the shape. It helps bring a little tension. O, 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 O. So it actually already sounds pretty similar, because remember the O is up sort of on like the back of the tongue, maybe halfway or so. So we're kind of already taking up some of that space already. When you transition from the O to the whether it's colored or not, remember we have to release that O part. So if you hold this here and you try to do the or, make sure you release that back of the tongue as you form the R in the middle. Or, that helps us make sure it sounds nice and clear. So the back of your tongue will sort of feel like it's up here, and then it's going to sort of maybe do this a little bit. Maybe a little exaggerated, but it kind of feels like that in the back of my mouth. Or, now there's a little bit of a range for that. The O can actually be pulled slightly forward. You can get a little bit more, a little bit less tension through the back area with the soft palate and the top of the throat. As long as it sounds good, it generally sounds clear. That's the most important thing. Remember, sound is king. Don't just blindly follow my description and think you have to do it exactly that way. There's a little bit of a range, a little bit of wiggle room. Focus on if it sounds good or not. Of course, the lips. So if we go from that O starting position, again, the lips are already engaged. O, okay, then we go for the or. So they're already out, so we don't have to bring them up and out like right? Or, you might push out a little bit more, but it's mostly just lifting from that already out position from the engaged O. Of course, we can maybe get a little bit more tension here, but they're already engaged to push out that O. Then just make sure as you release the or sound that you release all that tension, let the lips go back to normal or whatever the next sound needs. Or, notice as I go through that R, I can actually start releasing the lips. Or. Let's do a few exercises now. We're going to go at a slower speed 3 times, and then a little faster speed 3 times. And we're doing the fully R-colored version. If you want to do the one that's not actually R-colored, that's fine. Just make sure that you sound nice and good and clear and you're blending them well. Ear, 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 air, 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 R, 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 or, or. Now let's talk about the effects of the R on some consonant sounds. Now technically, if that R is preloaded after a consonant sound, it will have some sort of small effect, at least in how things sort of come out, but it may not actually change the consonant in a significant way. However, there are a few cases that I have found, there's probably even more, but there's a few cases I found that clearly show the effect of the R on some sounds, either the formation or the change of them. Now the first big example, and this is going to help so many of you out there who still struggle with the flap D to combination, like in the word water. The reason why that's difficult is because we do not do a normal flapped D. We do what we can call an R-controlled, or if you want R-colored, an R-controlled flapped D. Now what does that mean? Well, normally we're schwa controlled, right? So when we flap, we hit that D, provided that we have the conditions to trigger that flapped D. Again, it could also be when you see a T spelling, like in water, it's a flapped D. There's no such thing as a flapped T because you can't flap a T. Don't confuse spelling and sound. If, say, the sound after a flap D is an E, so if we say ready, okay, I'm probably going to tap and then flick forward a little because I got to get into that E. Ready, re, re. So I'm actually kind of doing this, but I'm tapping on about the same spot where I would normally put a T and a D, which is on that bump of the alveolar ridge. If I were to go into an ah, like read all of the books, read ah, ra, ra, ra. So I'm going to tap in the same spot and I'm just going to open into the ah. There's not a huge change there. It kind of maybe flicks this way or it taps and kind of comes down, but it's basically the same thing. It kind of goes up the same and then it might redirect to whatever sound it is, but there's not a huge change of how the flap D is made. When we're going into an there's a little bit of a different thing. This also is if we're going into a dark L, like in little, battle, etc. We're going to talk about that later. The biggest effect that the has, now obviously the is here in the middle. So just like it could tap and push forward this way to the E, we can tap and pull backwards into the However, the special thing that the does is because the wants to start pulling the tongue in this way, especially that front, it's pulling it into the middle, we don't hit the spot here. We don't flap it and tap it in the same place. What we do is we're actually going to hit back here. So there's your front teeth on the top, there's that bump of the alveolar ridge, and then there's that part of your mouth that starts going up and back right through here. That part there where it starts to go up, okay, not actually going up, but right where it begins, we're going to tap there and pull into the quickly. In fact, if I try to tap here instead, water, 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 water. It's a lot harder for me to say. I feel like I have to sort of forcibly push my tongue forward to that point and then pull it back for the R. It makes it a lot harder to say, makes it a lot harder to actually flap it instead of doing a regular D. It's starting to sound a little more like a normal D. Water, water. We don't want that. So instead, we're going to go back a little bit when we tap, and then we just, right there, okay? R, r, r. In fact, we have another little thing that makes this even easier. You don't have to try to tap with the full front of the tongue or even the full tip. I've talked about before how the TH sound, this is relevant, just give me a second. The TH sound, remember we can put it right behind the teeth. You don't have to put it between the teeth. But if you put it behind the teeth, we still want the air to flow around. So you can feel that like there's the corner of the tip and the corner of the tip, that are sort of touching the teeth right there. But then the tip is maybe down and out of the way a little so the air can flow through. We can get a similar type of thing when we're flapping the D into an Okay, we do that tap and pull. So you can actually let the very tip be a little lazy, hit more with the corners of the tip on because your mouth goes like this as it goes up. All right, so this part here, just like you have your front teeth here, now we're back here on this part that's starting to go up in your mouth. It's exactly the same. You're going to take the corners of the tip, you're going to make sure that you tap those two spots, but you can keep this a little more relaxed and down. And so there's actually a gap here that doesn't have to touch the top of the mouth. And that makes it even a little easier for us to sort of quickly tap and pull, tap and pull, tap and pull. So it's a very, very light tap. Water, When I do a normal flap D, what if, ready, ready. You can kind of hear it more like ra, ra, ra. But when I do this one, it's very, very light. Water, That's because this part of my tongue, the very tip, is not even touching anything. And you also have to make sure as you're going from a flap D into an obviously the brings in a bit more tension, okay? And you have to master the basic first before you even try to do this. But when you're tapping and pulling, remember the tap, the flapping motion of the flap D, wherever, it doesn't matter if you're going this way or this way or this way, whichever way you're going, you have to do it in a very light way. You can't force your tongue, you can't use this muscle to really try to like push it up and then pull it back. It has to sort of like it's flapping in the wind. So that's part of the relaxedness of the American English posture. The biggest, easiest example outside of the flap D that I think is relatively pretty well known by at least linguists, maybe some language learners, you may have noticed this yourself, is the ST becoming more of an SHT when there's an R consonant right after it. So for example, instead of saying street, you might hear street. Now, my understanding is that this did start as more of a regional thing, but it has been becoming much, much more common. And although I personally do recommend that you just use an S in this case, it does sound fine to use more of an SH sound as long as you can still blend everything and say the word really well. In fact, if you listen to my own speech, you will notice that as I'm naturally speaking, when I have this sort of STR combination, sometimes I use more of an S sound, sometimes I use more of an SH sound. It just, however it comes out, it doesn't really matter. In addition to this, remember that when we have a T followed by an R consonant, like in train, you can do a T plus an R, train, or you can do a CH and an R, because this is another way that the R can affect the sound before it. The reason why it's an option to change the T into a ch before an R consonant is because of the changes in the posture and the center of gravity for the R. You can sort of get it blended a little bit and do more of a ch, chur, chur. That will still sound perfectly natural and neutral, as I've talked about in other places. So when you have this STR combination, not only can you change the S into an SH, you can change the T into a CH. So we actually have STR, or you can pronounce it SHTR, or you can pronounce it SCHR, or you can pronounce it SHCHR. Street, 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 street. Now you can just pick whichever one is easiest for you. All of them are perfectly fine. In my own speech personally, any of those might come out any given time that I say a word with this STR combination. Note that this does not apply if there's an vowel after just an consonant. Also notice that straight from the beginning of the word street, no matter which particular combination of sounds I'm using, even if I just do a regular S and T before that R, the lips are already wanting to engage. S, s, s. Okay, normally we don't use the lips for the S. For the sh, yeah, it's the same lip motion for the sh and the but the S doesn't do that. S, s, s. But of course we know we can overlap the lips depending on what sounds we're coming into or going out of. So the fact that we can engage the lips straight from the beginning of the word with the S tells us that we can actually already be preloading that underneath. And then we get the effects of the T possibly changing to a CH and or the S possibly changing into an SH. So this is a little bit of a special case, I think, because before we were talking about how there's an R and then there's a sound right before it. In this case, there's an R and then there's a cluster before it, the ST cluster, which is actually two sounds, and it's actually preloaded all the way from the start. And this is not something you usually have to worry about. I don't think there are a whole lot of cases of this. Again, the preloading is not required at all. So the easiest, simplest thing to do would be if you're going to say street or whatever, regardless of if you change the S to an SH or the T to a CH, you don't necessarily have to preload that R. You can be doing a regular SH or regular CH and then blend, pull into that R. Just make sure that you do that transition correctly. That might be the easiest, simplest thing to do, so you don't have to worry about these variations, and just make sure you get in and out of the R when there's an actual R.